I became aware, and this was in 2003, 2004, 2005, leading up to my first COP in Copenhagen in 2009, I became aware that the climate crisis was affecting the poorest countries and poorest communities and small island states and indigenous peoples much more severely and much earlier than the rest of the world, the developed world. So during my 7 years as President of Ireland, from 1990 to 1997, I did speak about the environment, but I didn't speak about climate. It wasn't an issue for us. And that was something that really affected me deeply when I saw in these African countries, women would say to me, "Is God punishing us? What is happening in our world? This is beyond our experience. We sow and, a few weeks later, flooding comes when it shouldn't, or drought comes when it shouldn't. This has never happened in our experience." And I became aware of the impacts of that, in particular because these were communities that weren't actually responsible for the warming that was happening, for the emissions that were contributing to human-induced warming of our climate. And as time went on, I realized that there are various layers of injustice. That's the first one, the impact on the poorest countries, poorest communities, small island states, and indigenous peoples, who also happen to be, by and large, the black and brown and indigenous peoples of our world. So it's also a racial injustice. And within that, there's the gender injustice, the different social roles that women play, the different access to the table, access to decision-making, or lack of access, the lack of power, sometimes the lack of rights, like land rights, lack of access to credit, lack of training, and yet, very often it is women who are building resilience in their communities, who after a hurricane or a severe drought or severe flooding, band together in a women's group and help their communities to be more resilient. So there is a gender injustice, a gender dimension. Thirdly, there's the intergenerational injustice. And thankfully, school children and young climate activists have been addressing that, have been calling us out, saying, we understand the science now. We know that we're not going to have a safe future unless you, the adults, take responsibility. And of course, we're not doing enough, and they are rightly critical of us. The fourth injustice is a subtle one, but I think it's an increasingly important one. It's the injustice of the different pathways to development of different regions of the world. Developed countries, the United States, Europe, Japan, Korea, etc., we built our economies on fossil fuel. So our responsibility, of course, is to wean ourselves off what's destroying our world as quickly as possible, and to do it with just transition for the workers in coal and oil and gas, and in my own country, turf, peat. But what about developing countries? I was, as you heard, the special envoy of the UN Secretary General before the Paris and at the Paris Agreement. And I was very interested in what was a new development before Paris, that every country was asked to provide its nationally determined contribution. And I was really struck by the fact that so many developing countries in their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, wanted to go as green as possible, as clean energy as possible, as quickly as possible. But of course, you need the investment up front. You need the skills, you need the training, you need the intellectual property. And after Paris, we didn't respond with, an immediate coming to developing countries with more support for enabling them to go green. On the contrary, it's only now that we have jet peas for countries like South Africa and Indonesia, and where certain countries, including the United States, have come together to provide support to get, for example, South Africa to be able to come out of its dependence on coal, to enable Indonesia similarly. This should have happened much earlier.